Okay, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you very much for joining us for our talk about BTO Garden BirdWatch this afternoon. So my name is David White. I'm one of the Garden BirdWatch Supported Development Officers, and also have Rob Jaques, who's also a Garden BirdWatch Supported Development Officer. So this afternoon, we're going to do a talk about the scheme, about 25 years of Garden BirdWatch. So we've got quite a lot to cover. So without any further ado, I will start sharing my screen and then begin. Okay, so BTO Garden BirdWatch started in 1995. So as to the 25-year anniversary this year, very, very exciting for us. Okay, so, and there's a few statistics about the scheme here. Originally it was £17 to take part in the scheme. It's actually now free to take part in. So it was made free at the start of April. So the aim of the scheme is to spend up around 20 minutes up to weekly watching the garden wildlife and counting them and submitting counts to the scheme. So that is the idea in a nutshell. As well as birds, you can also report reptiles, mammals, dragonflies, butterflies. And over the course of the talk, I'll go through some of the species you can report and some of the interesting statistics we found out about them. Okay, so just to put a bit of a local spin on things to start off with. So this is a map of where people take part in Garden BirdWatch in southeast England. So with the talk being based in Eastbourne. So the blob of East Sussex is this little pink blob in the bottom left-hand corner. So that's the proportion of garden bird watchers in East Sussex compared to other areas in southeast England. And then in terms of what they see a variety of different things. It's mostly birds, but this graph does show you the proportion of different species. So as you can mostly see, you've got birds dominating most of the picture there, but you've also got towards the top left corner, you've got mammals, grey squirrels, and a few butterflies as well. So, as I said, it's mainly about counting the bird numbers in your garden, but you can also report other species as well. And just to go into Garden BirdWatch methodology, the idea is very simple, is to submit the highest count of each species that you see in your garden each week, or if you want to submit counts every week, that is. So in a way, it's very similar to the RSPB's Big Garden BirdWatch, which you may have heard of before. That's been running since 1979, and that takes place over the last weekend of January every year. So, and the difference being with BTO Garden BirdWatch, people, as I said, can take part in it up to weekly. So just to give you a quick indication of the methodology of the scheme, if you saw this group of birds on your feeders, so we have a lovely group of long-tailed tits on this feeder, that would be 6 long-tailed tits on the feeder. And if that's the highest number of that species you saw over the course of the week, that would be your weekly return for your Garden BirdWatch. So 6 long-tailed tits. So lovely birds feeding on peanuts there. So over the last 25 years, we find that garden bird numbers change. Certain species increase and other species decline. So here we have the 25-year rankings of birds in gardens according to the survey. So number 1 is the blue tit, the bird pictured in the right-hand corner. And then going through, I won't read them all, but just to point out really that the green numbers there, the ones that are highlighted in green, are the species that have increased since Garden BirdWatch began 25 years ago. And the red ones are the species that have sadly declined since Garden BirdWatch began. So what I'll do in a minute is go through some of the species that have either increased or declined and give you a couple of reasons why that possibly may be the case. So, and you've got a few species quite familiar to you all, I'm sure: woodpigeons, house sparrow, goldfinch, song thrush down at the bottom. Okay, so starting off to talk about the song thrush. So sadly, song thrushes have declined 8 places in the Garden BirdWatch ranking over the last 25 years, which is a real worry because song thrushes used to be a very, very common garden bird and very familiar to us all. But what has seemed to have been the case over the last 40 years is fewer song thrushes are now visiting gardens. So this has been reflected in not only the BTO Garden BirdWatch results, also the RSPB Big Garden BirdWatch results, which, as I said, that's been running since 1979, so a bit longer. So sadly, song thrushes have declined. There's several possible reasons why this is. It may be to do with the fact that the young birds aren't surviving their first winters as frequently as they used to be. Maybe competition from other species such as blackbirds. We're not sure, to be honest, but there are a few theories. And if you do have song thrushes in your garden still, you're very, very lucky. So sadly, greenfinches have also dropped in number over the last 25 years, which this is really quite a poignant story with greenfinch. So up until about 15 years ago, greenfinches were actually really increasing in gardens and doing very, very well. But unfortunately, they got badly hit by a disease called trichomonosis, which I'll speak more about later on in the talk. But it really, really affected greenfinch numbers in gardens, and it meant that greenfinches actually dropped by a third in gardens. And that's over the last 15 years or so, which is reflected in their 25-year rankings, dropped 7 places in that time, which is a real worry. And as I said, I'll go more into garden wildlife disease later on in the talk and what you can do to prevent it from spreading. So it's not all doom and gloom, though. One species that has increased since Garden BirdWatch began is the Nuthatch, which has climbed 6 places since Garden BirdWatch began 25 years ago. So this is a species that likes oak trees, especially. You like to find them in areas where there are older trees. But I mean, they are quite cosmopolitan and will be found in lots of different areas. So not only have they increased 6 places in the Garden BirdWatch rankings, they've also spread their range in Britain. So whereas they used to be very, very rare in northern England and Scotland, they're now being seen more and more frequently in those areas. So people are starting to see them a lot in areas where they never used to be. So it may be due to mild winters. We don't know for sure. But it's lovely to see nuthatches, and the picture you can see there's a very classic nuthatch pose. For some reason, they tend to enjoy feeding with their beak facing downwards. So you see them crawling down trunks and also feeding on bird feeders that way with their beak facing downwards. So another species that has increased markedly since Garden BirdWatch began is the woodpigeon. It's gone up 10 places. So we're aware that woodpigeons may not be everyone's favorite garden bird. They do appear to be quite rotund and appear to eat quite a lot of food. But the truth is they are very, very well feathered. So they're not that heavy a bird. They do eat a lot, though. We can't shy away from that. And they're also very, very opportunistic, which means that they're very, very good on monopolizing food sources when they find them. So not only are they good at finding food in gardens, they're also very, very good at finding areas to nest in gardens. So they'll nest in a variety of different evergreen shrubs. So gardens are a great habitat for wood pigeons, which is probably why they've increased so much in gardens over the last 25 years. And then the species that has increased the most since Garden BirdWatch began is the colourful goldfinch. So this species here, which has gone up 12 places since Garden BirdWatch began. So that's a really, really good news. And hand in hand with that, their population in Britain away from gardens has actually increased by 146% in the last 25 years. So in general, goldfinches have done really, really well. And one of the reasons why they seem to have increased so much is because more people are feeding them in gardens and feeding them foods like sunflower hearts and Niger seed. So they're now a very familiar garden bird to many people. So if you do have goldfinches, you're very lucky to see them. Very, very colourful birds, always nice to see in your garden. So here's a few quick statistics about Garden BirdWatch in general over the last 25 years. I won't read them all out. So one of them that always strikes me quite hard, you have the most weekly submissions from 1 week. So from one particular garden, 1,300. So what that means is that somebody who's been taking part in Garden BirdWatch for so long that they've submitted 1,300 weeks worth of Garden BirdWatch data over the last 25 years. That's real dedication. And it's amazing what results we get from those fantastic volunteers who have been taking part in the scheme for that long. And then down at the bottom, total number of individual birds and other animals counted at 194 million. So that's amazing. Over the last 25 years, so many different species have been recorded by the scheme. So, and a few other quick ones just as we go along. So the species with the most individual records is the house sparrow, which is, you may not be too surprised. And the species found in most gardens is the blackbird. Again, you may not be too surprised by that. Two very, very familiar garden birds. And then I'll go down to the stat at the bottom. Incidents of sick, injured or dead wildlife recorded, 160,000. So that's very, very important. So one of the things that Garden BirdWatch does is links in with the Garden Wildlife Health Project, which is a partnership project between RSPB, BTO, Frog Life and the Zoological Society for London, and it monitors garden wildlife health across Britain. So when people submit their garden wildlife counts each week, they can say whether or not they saw sick birds in their garden. And if they did, that data all goes into the Garden Wildlife Health Project's database and provides fantastic information about where these diseases are spreading. And also it means that we can find out what people can do to prevent them and look for trends within garden wildlife disease, because sadly they do spread. And again, I'll talk more about that later on in the talk. Okay, so a few more species that have increased or declined since Garden BirdWatch began. We have here a collared dove, a species that's a relative newcomer to British gardens. So they only nested in they only nested in Britain for the first time in 1955. So fairly recently, they've moved into gardens and are now quite a familiar sight to most of us. So their numbers have been dropping in gardens in recent years, which is a bit of a concern to us. Maybe competition from other species, but also that disease trichomonosis that I mentioned earlier on that affects greenfinches as well. That may be a contributing factor. So collared dove numbers seem to be dropping. It's one thing we're keeping an eye on, but it's not dropping drastically, but it is a bit of a concern. So a species that has increased in gardens quite markedly in some areas is the ringneck parakeet. So this is a species that it doesn't look like it did look like a native bird, and it's not actually a native bird. So nobody really knows where they came from, but they've mainly concentrated in southeast England, so especially in London, Kent and Surrey. So if you go to places like Richmond Park or Hampton Court, you will find lots and lots of these ringneck parakeets. And when their population established themselves, nobody really realised that their native range is in the Himalayas. So which means that they're very, very used to cold winters, and so that means they're very used to British winters. So it's not going to affect them at all. So they'll go onto bird feeders, move around in very, very noisy, squawking flocks. So if you've been to an area that's got parakeets, you'll certainly know they're there, because they're very, very noisy. And as you can see, very, very well, they're very brightly coloured, very green, and that very distinctive pink beak. Okay, reed bunting's another bird that sometimes comes into gardens. And what we found with reed buntings is that they tend to visit gardens mostly in the early spring, so in March and April. So at that time of year, the amount of seed that's available in the surrounding countryside tends to become quite scarce. So what happens is the reed bunting, which is a species that, as its name suggests, mainly nests in wetland or marshland, they actually abandon the farmland or the marshland and come and visit garden bird feeders, especially if you live near water. So my parents live in Poole in Dorset, so very close to the edge of Poole Harbour. And every March, they get reed buntings in their garden that come off the marsh just to feed up on the seed feeders. And then after that, so after April, their garden bird numbers tend to drop very, very markedly again. So it's very much a March and April species to look out for, the reed bunting. Looks quite similar to a sparrow, but it's a bit bigger. This is a male reed bunting with its black head and white collar and brown checkered sides. And then one more species to talk about, and then we'll go on to something slightly different. So this is a blackcap, which is a species of warbler. It's got a really, really interesting migratory story. So traditionally, it was thought that the blackcaps that bred in Britain, they went and wintered in southern Africa, in southern Spain, or northern Africa. So they were here for the summer, and then they went down down to southern Europe or Africa for the winter. But BTO studies have shown through bird ringing, so putting little metal rings on the bird's legs and colour rings as well, is finding that their migratory pattern is really a lot more complicated than it initially seemed. So it seems that now what's happening is blackcaps are starting to winter in Britain, but the birds that winter here aren't the birds that actually nest here. So they're birds that breed in Central Europe, in countries such as Germany, Austria and Poland, and then they come here to winter. But a recent bit of research, so very, very new, it only came out last week, in fact, has shown that, in fact, the blackcaps that winter here come from a lot wider area. So sometimes birds from northern Spain, southern France are also coming to Britain for winter. So their migratory pattern is a lot more complicated than initially thought. And the reason why we feature blackcap is because they're becoming more and more of a familiar garden bird, especially in the winter. So look out for these birds in your garden, especially between November and February. They will go on fat ball feeders. So look out for them because they're a nice little bird. So as this is a male, he's got a black cap, which, as you would have thought by the name, and then the female is similar but has a brown cap. Okay, so now talking about gardens as a resource for wildlife, very, very important. So I'll go into a few things that you can do now to attract wildlife to your garden. So, of course, one things that gardens are great for are for nesting birds. You get a variety of species of birds that nest in gardens. So here we have a starling nesting in a hole in a tree. So you have them nesting naturally. So, but also you can put nest boxes in your garden. So as you can see, there's a little juvenile blue tit peeking out of this nest box. So you can put nest boxes out. Best time of year to put nest boxes out is in the early spring, so February and March, and then hopefully the birds will move in by April. So gardens are a great area for natural food as well. So if you have plants like alders, so alders, that you can see the cones here. So you might attract this little bird, which is the siskin. So if alders are a tree that live near water, so grow near water. So that's one thing to look out for. And also berries are a very, very important food source for garden birds as well. So a lot of different bird species feed on berries, but the bird in this picture is actually a tiny goldcrest. So the goldcrest is Europe's joint smallest bird, a real tiny little bird that you may see in your garden this time of year. So they don't tend to eat berries themselves, but I just like this picture of the goldcrest and the berries because it's just lovely, and it's always nice to include a goldcrest. Okay, so another way of attracting different birds into your garden, especially thrushes, so is windfall fruit. So we have a blackbird here surrounded by windfall apples, especially in September and October. They love apples and other dried fruit as well. So that's a great way of attracting birds in. And then, of course, you can put bird feeders out. So you've got a few pictures of a few bird feeders there, a bit further away, but close up, you can have a seed feeder like this one, so full of sunflower hearts, mixed bird seed, and again the little birds feeding on that feeder are that little siskins again, the greenish birds I talked about just now when talking about alder cones. So they're not that common a garden bird, but just this feeder is absolutely covered in them, so it's just a nice picture to include. Okay, so if you want to attract species like bullfinches, which is the bird pictured here, you can put out other different seeds. So things like millet, which is what's in here, and other types of grain, and tree sparrows, which is similar to house sparrows, also like these foods. But I mean, bullfinches don't always visit feeders as often as other species, but again, they're lovely, colourful birds. And as you can see, two lovely male bullfinches feeding on this seed feeder here. So great way of attracting them in. So if you put peanuts out, you might attract various members of the tit family. So blue tits, great tits, even nuthatches, the species I mentioned earlier on. And also, if you're very lucky, this species here, which is a great spotted woodpecker, likes to feed on peanuts. So if you do see a great spotted woodpecker in your garden, look out for the colour or lack of colour on the back of its head. So the red spot on the back of the head of this bird means that it's a male. So the females don't have that. So a nice male, great spotted woodpecker feeding on peanuts. Okay, and then bird feeds are a great source of energy. So fat balls, pictures here, very, very popular with a variety of species. So this is a long-tailed tit again, a species I mentioned earlier on, will love feeding on fat balls, especially during cold weather. Okay, not all birds use bird feeders. Here we have a dunnock, a little bird that looks a bit like a robin or a sparrow, but it isn't. So also known as the hedge accenter or hedge sparrow, will sometimes use bird tables. If not, they'll be shuffling around the floor slightly inconspicuously, but a nice little bird nonetheless. So always worth having a bird table out because not all birds use bird feeders. Okay, very important to provide a fresh source of water in gardens at every time of year, especially if you get cold weather. If your bird bath freezes up, it's well worth making sure that you break the ice in there, because birds like us always need to drink and bathe no matter the time of year or the temperature. Have a lovely male blackbird bathing in the bird bath here and splashing around. Not all birds bathe in water. House sparrows actually bathe in dust, believe it or not, but most species will use water. Right, excuse me. So just a quick insight into our Gardenwatch survey. So this was a survey that was put together between BTO, British Trust for Ornithology, and the BBC Springwatch team. So, and it was launched last May. So what it was a nationwide audit of what gardens provide for wildlife, so across Britain. And I'm going to go through some of those interesting results now. So what gardens provide for wildlife in lots of different ways. So of all of the people surveyed, 42% of participants left leaf piles. So leaf piles are very important for composting, also areas for creatures to hibernate in, mammals and invertebrates, and also very, very good for mulching and for insects to shelter in as well. 30% of participants left grass to grow. So if you're able to leave a small area of grass growing in your garden, it's very beneficial, because birds like this blackbird love feeding in amongst long grass for invertebrates and other things. And invertebrates themselves love feeding in long grass. So crickets, grasshoppers, bees and other species like this, bees feeding on the flowers. So very important, if you can, just leave a bit of grass to grow in your garden if you can. We do appreciate it's not always possible though. So 19% of participants helped hedgehogs. So by that meaning feeding hedgehogs, providing hibernation homes for them, or even having fences in gardens that hedgehogs get through, so gaps in fences. So if you do feed hedgehogs, the best thing to feed hedgehogs in gardens is cat food. Very, very good, a good food source for them. Worth avoiding things like milk, mealworms in excess. Again, not to be recommended for hedgehogs, but cat food seems to be the best thing to feed hedgehogs. Of course, now at this time of year, they'll be due to go into hibernation fairly soon, but you may still be seeing them because it's quite mild. So house sparrows are a species that unfortunately has declined in many areas in Britain, but there are lots of different ways of helping house sparrows in your garden. So growing lots of different shrubs and also providing nesting habitats for them. So in the wild, they nest in the eaves of houses and in cracks as well. But you can also put nest boxes out for them. House sparrows like terrace nest boxes. So nest boxes that quite a few different families can move in because they're colonial nesters. So robins, of course, a very familiar garden bird to all of us, and most likely to be seen if you're out gardening on your garden fork or spade, following you around looking for invertebrates. So again, robins are a very, very familiar garden bird, And there's a lot that you can do to attract them, feeding them, putting out bird baths. But of course, just by your gardening actions, you'll be attracting robins in. So one of the things that Gardenwatch survey did show was that unfortunately chaffinch numbers have been dropping markedly, especially in England in recent years, which is a real worry. So since 2012, their population has dropped quite sharply in England. So we know that they are affected by that disease trichomonosis, which I mentioned earlier on. But there are also other factors which we're still looking into. But it's a species that is declining, which we're a bit concerned about. But you can put out food for them on bird tables. They don't tend to use bird feeders quite so much. You have a male chaffinch here. But bird tables they will use, so well worth putting them out, food on bird tables to attract the chaffinches in. And then, so now to talk quickly about two of our different surveys that we have as part of Garden BirdWatch, which cover a slightly unusual set of subjects. So the first one here is the Big Garden Beak Watch, which actually studies beak deformities in garden birds. So as you can see, this blackbird here, if you look closely, has got a lot longer lower mandible than upper mandible. So most birds with beak deformities do tend to be able to feed fairly normally, but the survey is looking out for beak deformities, which seem to be caused by something called avian keratin disorder. And it's something that's just to look out for, but most birds seem to adapt to it. So occasionally you'll see a starling with a long beak like this, another kind of beak deformity, which looks quite drastic, but they will find their way of going onto feeders, even if it means they have to hover like a hummingbird. And then you get sad cases like this, which is a rook, which has got a really crossed mandible. Now, that's a real concern if you see a bird like that, because that's going to really struggle to find food. But if you do see any birds with beak deformities in your garden, please do report them to our Big Garden Beak Watch survey, because it's useful to know when and where these beak deformities are occurring. So we also have our abnormal plumage survey, which, as it suggests, looks out for garden birds with plumage abnormalities. So as we have a male blackbird with a bit of white feathering, and this is caused by something called leucism, which is a lack of melanistic pigment in some of the bird's feathering. So it causes a bit of white feathering there. It's different to an albino. So for a bird to be an albino, it needs to be entirely white and have a pink eye. There's no such thing as a partial albino, whereas there is such a thing as a partially leucistic bird, which is what this bird is. Partially leucistic blackbird. Again, it seems to be caused by, in some ways, their diet, and it is genetic, and it will get passed down through generations from time to time. So here's a house sparrow, which again is showing a bit of leucism, of a white collar and a white cap. Does look like a bit like one of the rare American sparrows, but it is in fact a house sparrow, just with a slightly unusual plumage. And then just occasionally you'll find a bird that's entirely white and actually quite difficult to identify. So this is actually a dunnock, which is entirely leucistic. So really lacking melanin pigment, which means it's white with a yellow beak rather than brown. So can be very difficult to identify at times. We do get sent some really interesting pictures of these birds with abnormal plumage. And then just to show you the top 10 species that are affected by abnormal plumage, blackbird and number 1, house sparrow number 2. It's worth noting that most of the species in the top 6 are species with mainly black feathering, which indicates that the white will show up more. But then there's a few exceptions there. You've got great tit, blue tit, and goldfinch as well. Okay, so perhaps the most important part of the latter part of the talk now about disease in garden birds, which I've been promising since the beginning of the talk. So here we have a greenfinch, again, a species that is affected by the disease trichomonosis. So sadly, trichomonosis has been prevalent in the population for about 15 years, and it's sadly transmitted through the bird's saliva and exacerbated at bird feeders and bird tables. So, and it thrives in areas of of poor hygiene, sadly. So it's very, very important to keep your bird feeders clean. So if you have bird feeders in your garden, very important to give them a clean regularly every 2 weeks or so, and also disinfect them with a weak bleach solution, and also move them around, put them in different locations, just to try and prevent these diseases from spreading. And if you do continue to see diseased birds after you take those precautions, it's just worth taking your feeders down entirely for a couple of weeks just to prevent disease from spreading, because what you don't want is to be seeing birds like this. So this is a greenfinch with that disease, trichomonosis. As you can see, it's really not very nice. The bird is very, very fluffed up and lethargic, and also has trouble swallowing because it has issues with its gullet, which is what it used to swallow. So that's what a greenfinch with trichomonosis looks like. And so trich can be, well, its spread can be curtailed by good feeder hygiene. So that's my plea to you this evening. If you do have bird feeders, just to try and keep them as clean as possible to prevent these diseases from spreading. So it does occasionally affect chaffinches as well, as I mentioned, not as often as greenfinches. But another thing that does affect chaffinches occasionally is Fringilla Papillomavirus, which is a very long name for this little lesions on the bird's feet. So having scaly feet here, which is it encumbers the bird's movement, which unfortunately means that they're more at risk from predators. So if you do see birds like this, again, clean your feeders regularly. And if you do continue to see them, just stop feeding the birds in your garden, because it does affect chaffinches quite markedly, and also birds like bullfinches as well. So, and another disease to look out for is avian pox, which is this one, which shows itself in these tumor-like growths above the bird's head. This is a great tip with avian pox. So this is actually slightly different. This is more transmitted by insect bites rather than poor feeder hygiene, but it's still worth keeping your bird feeders nice and clean, because you don't want to be seeing too many birds like this in your garden. It doesn't affect them as much as trichomonosis, but it's still not very nice to see. So good feeder hygiene is very, very important. Okay, so coming towards the end of the talk now, just a quick couple of things to talk about some of our other work. So during the winter of 2018 and 19, the Garden BirdWatch team ran a tawny owl calling survey. So the aim was to find out how many tawny owls there were in gardens and in the local countryside. So participants were asked to spend 20 minutes once a week out in their garden listening for tawny owls calling between dusk and midnight. And the results were very interesting. So tawny owls seem to be doing very well in rural areas and quite well in some urban areas as well. So have declined in some places, but your best time of year to listen for tawny owls tends to be in October, sometimes in November, which is when the adults boot the youngsters out of their territory, can be very, very noisy. Especially listen out for them on clear nights, which are quite mild. So in fact, with the weather being as it is at the moment, you may hear tawny owls in your garden. So tawny owls, the male says tawoo, the song tawoo, and the female, the male and the youngsters all say tawit. So the tawit tawoo isn't one bird, it's actually two birds having a conversation, just in case you didn't know that. Okay, so just going to finish off now talking about some of the other garden wildlife records we have. So of course people can also record butterflies, dragonflies and mammals. Sadly I haven't got time to talk about too much now, but what we found last year, so the last February, which may seem like a long time ago now given the state of the world, we had a really warm spell at the end of February, which meant that butterflies like the brimstone butterfly were emerging a lot earlier. So this species emerging as early as February, when they usually came out in March. Then the holly blue butterfly emerging in really big numbers in April, when they usually come out a bit later than that. So really interesting to see how these trends go. And then the last species I'll talk about is the painted lady butterfly. So this is a really interesting species. They're migrants, which means that they come all the way from Africa, and sometimes the Middle East in different numbers every year. So every 10 years or so, though, you'll get a big influx of painted lady butterflies into Britain. So there was a big influx in 2009, and there was a massive one in 2019 last year. So suddenly there were lots of these painted lady butterflies in gardens. You may have seen one in your garden or in your local area. And the recording rate for painted lady, so how frequently they were seen in gardens, in most August, it's usually about 7%. Last year, it was up to 35%. So lots and lots of these beautiful painted lady butterflies, which had made their way from the continent. So, and what's happened this year, because it's not a painted lady year, it's actually meant that the recording rate's been really, really low again. So it really shows how their numbers fluctuate, and by people watching these species every week, how we find out about these fluctuations in population. So that's a real whistle-stop tour of BTO Garden Birdwatch and some of our results. But if you did want to take part in Garden Birdwatch, you can take part in it for free at the moment. So you can sign up via BTO Garden, bto.org/GBW. So the link on the screen there, sign up for BTO Garden Birdwatch. It means you can take part in the scheme up to weekly. Submit your garden wildlife records to us, birds, mammals, butterflies, dragonflies. You don't have to take part in the survey every week. There's no obligation to do it. And you can also, if you wanted, you can take part in paper forms if you don't want to do it online. And you also get sent a free newsletter each week, a e-newsletter, which will be emailed to you, which myself and my colleague write, just to share information about garden wildlife and what we're finding out by the survey. So I'd like to say thank you very much for listening, and sorry if it's been a bit rushed, trying to fit in as much as we possibly can in the time that we have. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen now, and if anybody has any questions, we'll be happy to try and answer them. Thank you.
Okay, pardon me. Got a few questions in, so I'll do my best to answer them. As David mentioned before, I'm Rob. I also work on the Garden BirdWatch team. I'll just take the questions as and when I see them. Any tips on feeding birds without attracting vermin? There is that risk of bringing in rats. It seems to be the main problem, but depending on what you consider vermin, it can be quite a broad scope. What we recommend is only putting out enough food to last for the day. If you put out more, it will linger. Birds are more likely to pull out the bits they don't like and get to the things they need, and it creates more mess. And choosing better quality seeds, it's very tempting to go for big packets of cheap mixed seed. What tends to happen with this, though, is birds will come to it and will pull out the seeds that they don't like and throw them to the ground. Over time, this begins to accumulate, and you're more likely to see things like rats underneath. If you are getting rats, put out less food, go for these individual bags of different types of seeds. So you can get millet for house sparrows, you can get niger seed, which is good for the finches, and sunflower hearts, which seems to be loved by most things, and then peanuts for your tits. If you are getting the rats, though, move feeders around as well. Rats are very much creatures of habit. They like to have easy food that they know where it is and they know it's safe. If you start moving things around, they will still be there, but you will likely see less of them. Okay, next question. Greenfinch numbers collapsed in recent years due to disease. Are they coming back, and were bird tables responsible? As David mentioned, it is likely that disease was spread through bird tables and bird food. There's also maybe other elements to it. There could be other factors going on in the countryside, which we've seen with different birds. So it could be loss of particular habitat, nesting sites. They will use insects to feed their young in the sun months. If there's less of those around, greenfinches will suffer. But it does seem to link very neatly with the spread of this disease. Are they coming back? Then they've sort of plateaued over the last few years. what we seem to see is some areas seem to see a little increase while others continue to go down. And as the disease has different outbreaks, these shift around a little bit. So overall, UK-wide, the numbers have steadied, but they aren't improving yet. Well, I think a lot of us were hoping that maybe greenfish would become more resilient to the disease. However, that doesn't seem to have quite happened yet. We're still getting lots of reports of diseased greenfinches. Okay, next question. I'm going to, I think I will. Oh no, these are different questions. My garden is home to seagulls, crows, magpies, and jackdaws. Is that going to put other birds off? It's a tougher one. Bigger birds will put off smaller birds. It depends what you're feeding them. If you're feeding small seeds like sunflower hearts and millet and peanuts, maybe not peanuts, but millet and niger seed and sunflower hearts, you're not going to get things like seagulls coming in. Definitely not going to put off the other birds. You may get crows and magpies and jackdaws. But if you're using hanging feeders, crows, magpies, and jackdaws will struggle to use those, and they may hang around underneath and pick up some fallen seed. But the smaller birds will be happy to take the seed above them. Oh, there's a couple here. Who are the best suppliers of bird seed in bulk? I can't answer that one, to be honest. It's probably going to be local. Look around, read some reviews. There's lots of different organisations which put together these things. As I said before, it's just I'd always recommend buying a particular bulk of one particular kind of seed, not a big cheap mixed bag. You'll waste less food and you'll get more of the birds you want to see. It's best to have like individual feeders with different kinds of seed in, as opposed to 4 feeders with all the same mixed stuff in. If I put food on a bird table, it'll be inside a squirrel or a crow in 10 seconds flat. Are there table designs that keep them out? Crows, as I mentioned before, hanging bird feeders are probably going to put off a lot of crows. They may just take the bits that fall out underneath and, if anything, help keep things tidy. Squirrels are a bit of a perennial problem. There's no real easy answer. Keeping feeders away from the edges of your garden, away from trees and bushes, that'll probably deter them somewhat, but they probably will make it across. It's easy food for them. They're good climbers and they're very intelligent. There are some feeders that claim to be squirrel proof. You get fat ball feeders with mesh around them, which is big enough to let in some of the smaller birds, and squirrels tend to keep out of those, but they're not 100% successful. So it's a bit of experimentation. If your squirrels are in an area where they've got lots of natural food, they may be less likely to put lots of effort into your garden and trying to work out how to get into the feeders. If you're in a more urban area, maybe it's too good of a source of food. They will spend a lot more time trying to work out how to get in. And what should we do? What should we be doing in our gardens to provide nesting spaces and food sources in the breeding season? That's a really good question. Nesting spaces, wherever possible, have hedges, thick hedges and climbing plants, so ivies, honeysuckles, that sort of thing. Ivy's fantastic all year round. It doesn't pull down trees and buildings, as people used to believe, and it's fantastic for nature. It's a really good place for nesting sites, can accommodate a lot of different birds, and also roosting sites in the winter. And then the flowers attract lots of insects in the autumn months, which are good for breeding birds. And then in later winter, when the berries come out on ivy, that's more food for the birds. And also just trees and hedges, these different environments. But if you're not able to do that, you might live in rented accommodation, or maybe you just don't have the space to put these plants up. Just nest boxes. On our website, you can find designs to make your own nest boxes and advice if you're buying a nest box, what designs to look out for, what to avoid. There's lots of over-decorated ones, particularly ones that have a little perch at the front outside the hole, which we don't recommend. A lot of bird box manufacturers add this on because they think it looks nice, I think, or birds need it, but they don't. They can fly straight into the hole without it, and it just gives a perch for predators to get into the nest box. So we avoid that. But there's designs on there if you want to make your own. Advice on the best kind of designs to buy on our website. And the second half of the question, food sources in the breeding season. In the breeding season, you can still provide seeds for adult birds. So a lot of them will find that very convenient to feed themselves. And there's a few myths around when to put out seeds, but birds know not to give seeds to their chicks if their chicks can't handle it. So there's very little reason to worry about that. And it's useful for the adults in the summer. If you're wanting to get more insects in your garden, having lots of plants, like I mentioned before, the climbing plants like ivy is really good for accommodating lots of insects, and leaving parts of your garden to go wild, have long grass, thick hedges, ponds are really good for getting lots of small flying insects, and that's a great way to get in lots of different insects that your garden birds will then feed to their young, and also attract other animals like frogs and hedgehogs. And I did kind of a whistle-stop tour there. Oh, we've got one more question in. I think I might be able to squeeze it in. Is there anything you can do if you find a sick bird? We can't offer much advice in terms of the actual care given. It's best as most areas have a local wildlife rescue. So if you Google your local area, wildlife rescue, a centre will come up. They can give better advice than we could. If you're worried about maybe a cat predating it and it's an ill bird, you can just pop it in a box and let them know. If it's a bird that's fallen out of a nest, we always advise put it back into a hedge. The parents will find it themselves. But yeah, speak to people with actual medical knowledge about ill birds, as opposed to us, which we're very good at reporting it and maybe diagnosing, but not know really how much to fix the birds. And yeah, I think that's from me.
Okay. Thanks, Rob. So thank you very much, everyone, for listening. So again, take a look at the website if you'd like to find out more. So thank you very much.
Oh, I'll just answer. There's a little bit of discourse that's come in. Aren't peanut husks bad for chicks? They're not great, but fortunately, adult birds know not to give peanuts to their chicks. It's only in times when they get really desperate and they can't find any natural food they may start to. And so I think people have found dead birds with peanuts inside them, dead chicks. But this is probably what's happened is these chicks were starving because they couldn't find any natural food, and the parents were desperate and feeding them peanuts, and they probably died from starvation more than anything else.